Hello and welcome to another week back with the Refuge Church. We are continuing our series through the book of Exodus or the book of Shemot. In the previous weeks, we talked about the intro for the people of God and what's going on with them. Then we had a little prologue from Moshe or Moses. And then we got introduced to God for the first time in the story. And now we're really going to move into the story this week. And I'm so excited to dive in with you. So let's pray and get started. God, I pray for this message and for myself and this recording, Lord, that it might bless whoever you have in mind for it to bless. I pray that we would become more attuned to you during this time, that we might be drawn closer to you and be able to hear you calling to us. I ask that you would open up our hearts and minds to hear whatever it is that you would have for us this week, and to help us focus and help me teach clearly and understandably. I ask all these things in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so this week we're starting Exodus or Shemot chapter 3. And a couple weeks ago, I gave a little overview before we started of what Midrash is and what Talmud is, and spent a little bit of time introducing those concepts as we'll continue using them week by week. This week, I wanted to, before we first dive in, give a little bit of background on a hermeneutic tool. A hermeneutic is just a method of interpreting the Bible. So when we come across something, how do we decide what we think of that passage or how we think about that passage? That's a hermeneutic. This particular hermeneutic tool is called the law of first mention. You might be familiar with it already, but it's the idea that the first time something shows up in the text, it is an image or a vignette or the quintessential idea that you're supposed to keep in mind for that image or for that concept for the rest of the book. It might sound a little weird, but we see Jesus using it. For us in our culture, it's a little bit like when you're watching a film and a character in the film says the name of the film in the script and you go, aha, and you think, oh, okay, they're self-referencing there in order to help me understand kind of what this movie is about and communicate something about theme, right? So an example of that is in Exodus 17, we see a first mention of the word that we would usually translate faith or faithfulness. And it's Moshe is helping out the people of Israel. They're fighting a battle under the command of under Joshua, Yehoshua. And Moshe holds up his staff in his arms, and with the help of Aharon and Hur. And it says that when he holds up his arms, the battle goes well for the Israelites. And when he lowers his arms, they start to fail in the battle. And so the way with which that Moshe holds up his arms so that they might prevail is called emunah, faithfulness. So from that image, from that law of first mention, we can think every time we hear about faith or faithfulness that it's not about intellectual assent so much as keeping steady to something that's difficult for the sake of yourself and the community and the overall victory. And it's something that requires the help of friends, right, and the community because of Aharon and Hur. So that's the idea of first mention. Every time we can read that word, emunah, in the Hebrew, in the text, we can remember, oh yeah, that story in Exodus 17. So we're going to come across this tactic as we look at the text today. And of course, if you don't particularly, if you're not swayed by the argument that this is what the narrator had in mind when putting this story together or recording this story for us, that's fine. But what I do want to invite all of us to is to think critically about, why does something look that way? Why is it that God showed up in this specific way? So if you don't want to use the traditional hermeneutic or the way of thinking about it that I present, that's great, that's fine. I am excited to talk to you about it in discussion on Sunday night at 7:30. But what else might it be other than, well, that's the way that it says. That's not inviting us to think critically, to think actively about the Bible. That's kind of lulling us to sleep of just reading the same story over and over without asking questions. It's not what we're hoping for. So that's the law of first mention, and I'll come up today. But we don't start there. We're going to start in Shemot chapter 3, verse 1. And it says, Moshe, by the way, quick recap if you don't remember, the scene opened, he had stabbed an Egyptian, buried him in the sand. The next day he was called out by one of his Hebrew brothers, and it says that the Pharaoh was going to kill him, and so he fled town, head out into the desert, got kind of adopted by this figure at the end of chapter 2, who is described as being the Kohen, the priest of Midian. This place of strife was what Midian meant. And then we went back and checked in on God for a minute, and now we're back with Moshe. So what has he been up to since marrying into that family? It says, Moshe was shepherding the flock of Yitro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian. Wait, we have to stop already, because just a few verses ago, we were told about his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. So it can't be a different guy. It doesn't say that he married somebody else who had a different father-in-law and a different high priest. But here in verse 1, it says the flock of Yitro. And earlier, it said that his father-in-law's name was Elle, which meant friend of God or neighbor of God. Yitro means abundance. So what's going on? It's the same guy. He has two different names. There's a couple different ways you can think about it. Sometimes people in the Bible just have different names, right? Jacob or Yaakov, famously, of course, his name gets changed to Israel, as does Avram becomes Avraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, right? There are these people who get their names changed. However, it's not told to us in the story that has happened or why it's happened, like it does in these other places. And Yitro means abundance, greater, more, having more than enough is the idea of behind Yitro. And then later, the O will be taken off of the end of his name, and it'll be Yetel. So why does this guy have three names? I can't off the top of my head think of anybody else in the Bible who has three names, one of them being linguistically similar, when we're not told of a name change. One other potential theory, which I want to make you aware of if you haven't stumbled across it before, is the documentary hypothesis, which is an idea put out by the Germans at the end of the 1800s, especially by a fellow named Wellhausen. Wellhausen became famous because he first really postulated that the Bible, or Torah, the first 5 books, is written from 3 different authors from 3 different time periods, and then the book of Deuteronomy, or Devarim, is a completely different author entirely. One of them's much older, middle, and then one's written by the priests. So that the idea behind that is there are these 3 different versions, and then somebody or a community of people called the redactor came and stitched all of those different ways of telling the story together. So they didn't edit anything, they didn't crop anything out, because if they were going to edit, surely they would have changed it all to be Elle 3 times, or Yitro 3 times, or Yeter 3 times, but they didn't change anything. And the idea is the redactor had a great love and trust for the text, and so he didn't want to change anything, but rather he or she or they simply stitched these different passages together. That is one way of explaining this difference. If you guys have other ideas, I'm excited to hear them. If that deeply displeases you, then you can chuck the documentary hypothesis out the window. That's also fine. It's going a little bit out of vogue at the moment in the academic world because we haven't found any, one of the reasons anyway, is because we haven't found any archaeological evidence for these 3 or 4 source texts. And if that was the case, if Wellhausen was correct, then we would expect to have each individual form, before it was stitched together, found scattered across the land, like we have these different manuscripts that we have found places like the Dead Sea. So we haven't found any of those. So if you don't like it, no pressure, it's fine. You could just tootle on, but please tell me your ideas for why Elle has 3 names. So there we are. Moshe is shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, whatever his name is, priest of Midian. And it says, and he led the flock behind the desert. So first off, shepherding is not a particularly prestigious role, right? So Moshe has gone from being a prince of Egypt and in the court, surrounded by power and prestige and what we like to call empire. And now he has found himself surrounded by a flock, which could be goats, could be sheep, could be some cattle in there, trundling around the desert. Why? He's probably having a really hard time, which we'll look at later, but he's probably wrestling with his identity. Who am I? Am I a Hebrew? Am I Egyptian? Should I just live the rest of my life in Midian? Is this my new family? Who is he on an identity level? What should I do? And that he knows that his people group, the immigrants who he is born from, are undergoing severe oppression a couple hundred miles away, give or take. What should he do? And he's having this wrestling match, and in the middle of this, he's a shepherd. And that could be for a reason, because the word he led the flock, it's the word nahag. And the word nahag is still used all the time in modern Hebrew. If you are in Israel today, you're on public transportation like a bus, you will all the time hear the crowd yell nahag at the bus driver whenever he closes someone in the door or misses a stop or a piece of the bus falls off. You'll hear it all the time. So it can be the word for driver or leader. So here we see Moshe, before he steps into this role of being one of the primary salvific figures, one of the heroes of the Bible for us, he's trundling around the desert as a shepherd. But why? He's practicing leading his people, right? There are so many famous shepherds in the Bible who go on to bigger things. We have David as a shepherd, etc. So he's cutting his teeth, as it were, in this particular role. So if you don't know why you're in a particular season of your life, you might be comforted knowing that no matter how difficult it is or how unexpected it is that you find yourself in that job, especially in the pandemic, or in this place, moved to a strange new area, with this family, somebody you moved in with, never would have thought. It might all be for a reason that you can't possibly imagine. One of my favorite Welsh nonconformists who said this 400 years ago. He said, "Let those who think themselves buried alive be content to shine like lamps in their sepulchres and wait until God's time comes for setting them on a candlestick." So Moshe does not realize that he's having leadership practice. If I didn't say that's what nahag means, it means to lead. He's leading them through the desert, and he doesn't even realize what's about to hit him, right? You never know when you'll be taken out of your sepulcher and set on a candlestick. So he leads the flock where? Behind the desert. It says achar hamidbar. Achar means following or after or behind the desert. So this is like the armpit of the desert. You keep going into the wilderness, into where it's awful, and then you keep going. And that's where Moshe is. The desert, of course, is a motif we've already talked about a little bit, but for a place of strife, a place of wrestling, you don't know what's going on. It's not the place of flourishing. It's a place of struggle. The first time I was in Hamidbar, in the desert, the Negev specifically, in Yisrael, it was my first day in Yisrael. And I went on a hike and I got heat exhaustion and ended up collapsing on the floor of a convenience store. Would not recommend. However, so this is not the ultimate place where you're lying back in your vineyard and enjoying. This is a place of difficulty. However, in the word midbar, which is literally, is translated desert, it literally, in the image behind the name, means place of the word or place of speaking. So I think we have an image even in the name of the desert, the word being midbar, that when you cannot hear the voice of God, when you're in this place of strife, of contention, of not knowing what is going on, you have the option to recede into the desert, into a quiet place, into a place of solitude, away from the hubbub of everything, even if you have to take your sheep with you. And that is where you can hear the voice of God. So if you're in a place of wrestling and you're not sure what you believe, or you're not sure if you're on solid ground or who you are invited to come into a desert, whether that's spiritual or physical, but creating a space for yourself, like we talked about Lent last week, to be able to hear the voice of God more clearly, which is exactly what happens to Moshe. So there he is. Next verse. And he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. Okay, so again, I do not want to be just skimming over things. Oh yeah, of course, I know this story. I know exactly what happens, jumping on eagerly to the next verse, as tantalizing as that might be. What is up with God having a mountain? Why is it called the mountain of God, Horeb? What does Horeb mean? These are all good questions that we want to stop and ask. So we hear a lot, if you read in the Psalms especially, God has a mountain. He often talks about in his holy mountain. And here in the English, it's usually transliterated Horeb, but it's written Horeb. If you click through, if you have your online concordance or biblical dictionary or what have you, and you click back, you might get to Harav, being desolation, maybe something about thorns. So the idea is maybe that Moshe is way out in the desert, way out beyond the end of the desert, and he comes to a mountain of desolation. And the message is that even when you've arrived at Mount Doom, at this mountain of desolation, even there, God is there. And that is why it is the mountain of God. It could be called the mountain of God just because it happens to be where God shows up and speaks. However, there are a lot of places in the Bible where God shows up and speaks, and that place is not always called the mountain of God or the valley of God or the plain of God. So what is it about this particular mountain? I want to put forth a theory that will either exasperate or delight you. But the word Horeb can be related to desolation, right? Like we said, that's one way to interpret the language. However, the word cherev, which is the exact same word with slightly different vowels, the vowels were put in years and years and years later by a group north of the Galilee who invented the vowels that weren't in the language before. So when we hear like, oh, well, that's slightly different, it wasn't in the original text. So the letters in the original text before vowels got put in are exactly the same. Charev, chorev, etc. Cherev is the word for sword. Now, what place of God is marked by a sword? If you think back, last time we saw a sword in the story, or the first time that we see a sword in the story, is in Genesis, when Adam and Eve are removed from the Garden of Eden. There is a cherubim, there is a cherub, cherub, not the happy little floaty kind with the wings, but a cherub, and we're not actually sure what that is, but some kind of supernatural being is given a giant flaming sword. So one potentiality for why this is such a holy place, and we'll look at this more next week, is it could be referencing that it is the place where the gates to Eden is, right? Because it's the mountain of the sword. What other place but the sword might there be? Now you can throw that out and say, I'm being Nicolas Cage from National Treasure. That's totally fine. I just think it's an exciting possibility. and we might see a little bit more evidence towards that theory later. This is part of the fun of biblical interpretation. If we're not really just searching for doctrine, taking the time to say, why does it say this, is part of what brings life back into the story for some. And if that's a stretching exercise for you that makes you feel uncomfortable, maybe that could be a positive too. Trying something new. The last possibility for why it's called the Mountain of God is tradition puts that Mount Chorev is the same as Mount Sinai. And again, there's not a really clear description of why Mount Sinai, where God appears later to the people after the Exodus, would be called the Mountain of God either. But there it is. It's the third possibility. So he's showed up at this mountain. Maybe you just like the first one. It's like Mount of Desolation and God's there too. That's great. That's totally fine. Again, come to discussion. We'll talk about it. Okay, so here's the big verse, what we've all been waiting for. If you know the story. And he saw an angel of God in the heart of the fire, and from within the thorn bush. And he saw, and behold, the thorn bush burned in fire, and the thorn bush was not eaten. So, first stumbling block for some of us, we like our world to be very orderly, and that might not include supernatural occurrences. So what on earth is an angel doing here? What is an angel? It's the word malach. Sometimes it means messenger, or it always means messenger, but sometimes you can interpret it as being a human. It's used for a messenger from David's court later in the books of Samuel. However, sometimes it's very clearly not just a human messenger, because it says a voice from heaven, an angel of the Lord spoke, which I would posit is probably not just regular human flying around in the sky, and it's probably not a regular human messenger inside a fire inside of a bush, or I hope not. So I'll leave that to y'all for now to wrestle over whether angels really exist or not. If you haven't been coming to discussion, it'll be a good one. We can talk about all these things. Okay. However we imagine them, they're probably not like they are in the Renaissance with little halos and everything, but that's fine. Maybe he sees a little angel that you put on the top of your Christmas tree in the fire. That would be amusing. So the angel of the Lord in the heart of the fire, within the thorn bush, God can show up in a million ways. That's one of the great things about God. Later in the story of Elijah or Eliyahu, he hears God's voice in a whisper. God shows up in a giant column of fire later. He is a giant pillar of cloud later. He can do whatever he likes. So why here is he using an angel to speak out of the heart of a fire in the midst of a thorn bush? It's a good question. It's a question that I think is best solved by looking for clues through the law of first mention. And again, if you are displeased by that, that's on you. But I would say come up with some other reason for why God chose to show up that way. And if maybe you're just comfortable saying God's God, he can do whatever he wants, that's fine. But let's ask ourselves, what imagery might God be evoking by using this very specific and strange lineup of images? Okay, an angel of God. The first mention of an angel of God, wonderful story, one of my favorites. There's a woman named Hagar who has been chucked out into the desert, again, by her employers, was a nice way to say that. And she is afraid that she is going to die because she's pregnant and very, very alone in the desert. And an angel of God shows up and says, do not fear, you will be all right. You're going to have a son. His name will be Ishmael. He is going to have a whole nation that will come out of you. You're going to live. It is all right. Okay, so the next image in the story, we've had our angel introduction. It's reminding us of the story in which doom is certain and yet is averted through the voice of an angel. Here in the story, Moshe is lost and alone and does not know who his family is or what he's going to do next. And an angel shows up, a salvific figure again. And so what's the next image? We have a fire. Fire is almost always the presence of God, who is called a consuming fire much later in scripture, right? He shows up as the pillar of fire later, but previous to this, he has shown up as fire in a covenant that he makes with Abraham, the patriarch of the whole faith. Abraham is put to sleep and God shows up as a fire and goes through this covenant, blood path covenant on Abraham's behalf. So fire, usually presence of God. Next, why a thorn bush? We are going to go back to 2 stories. First one we'll just stick with for now. But Hagar is kicked out again from her camp and her employers, but this time with her baby son, the one that was promised. And again, she is alone and does not know what to do and is certain that he is going to die, her baby son. And so she sets him under a bush and walks away because she can't bear to watch it. And again, she hears the voice of God and says, actually, there's a well right over there. I have heard your cry. It's going to be okay. So a bush there is a picture of the end is near. However, we also see it a little bit later in Genesis when Abraham is about to kill his son, Yitzchak, and what I believe is a misunderstanding or anyway, Abraham is about to kill Yitzchak, and an angel, ding, 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 again shows up and says, no, don't look over there. In the thicket, in the thorns over there is a ram that you ought to kill instead. And so thorn bushes are also signs of deliverance from certain doom. And so the threading of these images together leads the reader, who is presumed to be Jewish and presumed to know about the law first mentioned, and presumably has all of these stories memorized by heart. And as soon as they hear bush, they think, oh, of course, I know where that came from. That's the idea. And so where is it leading to? Where are all of those little images leading to? We'll see. The next verse says, Moshe said, I will turn aside and I will see this great sight. Why is the bush not burned? Very good question. And God saw that he had turned to see. So maybe you've heard maybe the most famous midrash, because a famous teacher plucked it out and talked about it in the past 20 years. But the midrash says that this bush had been burning for years and Moshe had just never noticed it before. And today he finally saw it and decided to turn aside. So the invitation for us is to say, where are the burning bushes in your life? What are the things that are signs of the presence of God, signs that it's going to be okay all around you that God has put up that we have been blind to? Once we notice them, that isn't the end to say, oh yeah, there's a sign way off that God is actually good and my life is going to be okay. Instead, through Moshe's example, we're invited to go off of our path and go investigate and go check it out and see what is this great sight. Because it says that God saw that he had turned to see. And then God called to him from the midst of the bush. So the angel is dismissed, right? The angel is replaced by God, which to me really says that the use of an angel was to show us this connection with an earlier story. It says, God now called to him from the midst of the bush. And he said, Moshe, 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 Moshe. Just 2 times. But, so Moshe turns off the path. He goes and looks. God sees that he has potentially finally seen the burning bush. And he says, yes, this is my chance. And then he calls him by name. Some of us in our spirituality interact with God in terms of God is someone distant, way out there, and I can kind of tell whether God's psyched about what I'm doing or disapproving by these different signs. That's not to say that signs aren't real or a thing because the burning bush is there. But after the sign, we are then invited into personal relationship of speaking with God. So the next time you see a sign or you think, oh, wow, that's crazy. Is that about God? The next thing is to then ask God, right? That's the idea. So God says, Moshe, Moshe. And again, to back up the first mention, why does he say his name twice? We want to be critically thinking about the text. So why twice? Last person who had their name said twice was Avraham. And it's in the same story that we already looked at with the bush and the angel and him trying to kill his kid Yitzchak. That's super beautiful because in this moment, Moshe probably feels like Yitzchak. It says that he was chased out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, by his adopted dad or granddad, the Pharaoh. And so he feels like Yitzchak because his dad's trying to kill him. However, in the saying of the name twice, God is presenting to him, no, actually, you're Avraham. You're the one who is the leader, who has the opportunity to save your people. And your people, that's actually the one in danger. You're fine out here in this hiding place, in this sanctuary of the desert where you get to meet me and interact with me and hear my voice. But your people are about to be killed. So in saying Moshe, Moshe twice, he's calling him like he called Avraham. And Moshe responds the same way by saying, here I am, which is so important for us to say yes, to show up. When we hear the voice of God, I'm here, I hear you. What is it that you have for me to say? The very final thing to throw in before we close out this rapid train ride of discovery this week is that Moshe, or Moses as it's transliterated into English, has a meaning in Egyptian. We hear when Moses gets his name that his mother, his adopted mother, specifically chooses a Hebrew meaning name for him. But Moses also means son of. We know Moses means son of. It means son of Tut, King Tut. So the next king after Tut was Tutmosis. And so here's Moshe having a complete identity crisis out in the midst of the wilderness. And the first thing that God says twice to him is, my son, my son. And so God, when he calls to us, he knows exactly what it is that we're going through. Moses is having this huge identity moment. Do I belong to the Hebrews? Do I belong to the Egyptians? Do I belong to the Midianites? And God says, that's up to you. But first, you are part of my family. You're my son twice. And so that ought to also be how we interact with others. Hopefully, if we're mirroring the face of God and the character of God to our community, may we first, before we do anything else of telling anybody what to do and how they ought to adjust their life or think about something differently or etc., may the very first thing we do be to invite them into belonging as part of this greater family, right? So that's what God does with us. So may you know that you are a member of God's family. Even if you are in the wilderness, may you be on the lookout for burning bushes because God is for you and maybe they're everywhere and you just have not noticed. Okay, let me pray. God, I thank you that you are mysterious and that your ways are above ours, and that means that we have an ever unfolding invitation to dive into knowing you better and knowing your text better. I thank you that it is a gift that your book has depth and layers in it. It is not a stumbling block, but something that we get to look forward to in the rest of our lives, talking with each other about why this is called the Mountain of God. But I pray more than that we might see your presence popping up all around us and that we might have the strength to set aside what we're doing at that moment and be able to turn and look at what it might be that you might have for us. May we know that we belong before anything else, God. May we be grounded in a knowledge that we are part of your family, no matter where we come from, no matter if we're a murderer like Moshe, no matter what's going on in our day, that we belong to you first. we are safe with you first. I thank you for who you are and for your text, and ask that you'd be with us for the rest of the week. Amen. Okay. Discussion, 7:30 Sunday night. We'd love to have you. Your voice is fascinating and important, and we'd love to meet you face to face. We haven't already. This is another short passage. I'm aware of that. That was another week of only doing 3 verses instead of a whole chapter. But there's so much. I already cut out a bunch to try to fit everything in, which just wounds me. So thanks for sticking with it for as long as we might all be together. For you to check out the PDF, which is in the description below, which has my translation in it, which we used today, and discussion, reflection questions if you're not able to join us Sunday night on Zoom. Okay, I'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.